Hey everybody, welcome back to the Convo Couch. I'm Fiorella Isabel, and today I have a very special guest with me. She has done amazing, extensive reporting in Syria. She's an independent journalist, and she is really being attacked by the mainstream media propaganda machine in the BBC in the UK. And this is all for just telling the truth. I have Vanessa Beeley here with me. Thank you, Vanessa, for being here.
Hi, thanks so much for having me back on. I'm not back on.
Yeah, well, I did a story about you.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Well, you and Eva Bartlett, like I said, your work has been amazing, and it's been one of the only few independent sources that we've had, especially dealing with the Syrian chemical attacks, which, my partner and I from the start we were like, this something smells here. Like, this is definitely not anything real. Well, with the mainstream media, all of them lining up and saying, "Oh yes, Syrian chemical attacks," and then pushing Assad and trying to use it as a way to push a coup, which is what we do all over the world. So no surprise, of course, that this would be any different. Now, months ago, you shared your exchange with BBC correspondent and producer Chloe Hajimateo, who accused you, among other things, of being a Russian and Syrian-funded journalist, as she soon would be airing this documentary on the White Helmets. Can you tell us more about the interactions during that time?
Yeah, I mean, this started back in May 2020. Of course, it's not the first time that the BBC has attacked me, as has The Guardian, as has The Times, as has the Huffington Post. I think the Huffington Post journalist Chris York has written in the region of around 12 articles all attacking me. So, I mean, I call them the stalker brigade because that's effectively what they are. I mean, they're just there to stalk, to smear, to attack, to discredit. Very much along the lines, of course, of the Israeli Zionist lobby, which is all about attacking the messenger, not attacking the message, not dealing with the evidence that's being presented, simply trying to discredit the messenger. As you pointed out, I'm not a journalist, according to Chloe Hadjimatheou. Despite the fact, and I don't like to big myself up, but I was a finalist in 2017 for the Martha Gellhorn Award, which that year was run by Robert Parry. Eva Bartlett, who has also been a recipient of smears from Chloe and from the BBC in the past, and currently was also a finalist that year. So, while in their view, we don't adhere to the establishment view of what journalists should be, which I view as simply state stenographers, the Mockingbird media that is instructed to run specific stories that, as you say, support and underpin the US and UK. I see them very much as one entity as regards their kind of neoconservative imperialist adventurism. And these journalists are basically tasked to discredit anyone who signals or exposes any of their intelligence, largely deep state operations, to destabilize a target country.
Exactly. And this is the Western Empire once again working in coalition to pretty much paint a narrative using the what should have been the fourth estate, which should be the oversight to the government, to whatever entity, political and powerful entity or governmental force there is, and instead of doing that, they basically just become propagandists, and they have turned it around to saying that, if you are speaking against their narrative, you are a conspiracy theorist, and they're using conspiracy theories and making them facts, which is like a world upside down right now, right? It's just
Yeah,
crazy.
absolutely. And I mean, we have the COVID-19. I mean, my argument is this entire hybrid war strategy, which I discussed with Steve Poikonen at length, which is basically everything that is non-military that is used or weaponized against, as I said, the target nation. So this is information war, media war, political war, diplomatic war, economic war, of course. We can't forget the most important, the use of sanctions as a battering ram to destroy and devastate target nations. But what we're now seeing, of course, with COVID-19, in my opinion, is the turning of this hybrid war strategy against their own populations by the transnational predator class, not by governments per se. To me, the governments themselves are only instruments of a far greater power. And very much so in the waging of these hybrid wars against target nations like Venezuela, Libya, Iraq, Syria, etc., even Palestine historically. What is behind these wars is not necessarily the president that is currently in power, but the deep state behind that, the neoconservative influence, the Israel lobby, etc., the vast military-industrial complex, the pharmaceutical complex, all of these massive sort of philanthro-capitalist global predator class, as I call them, or even psychopathic class in many cases. Those are the ones really behind pulling the strings.
Exactly. So going back to your experience in Syria, what exactly did you experience regarding the faux chemical attacks that you wish to highlight from your coverage? I know you wrote several articles and for RT, and you did your own independent reporting, but what was one of the key things that made you go, wow, like this is shifting, a worldview? Are these people that evil to really stage and manipulate all of this?
Simple answer, yes. And I think if we go back in history, we see the precedents. We see the fabrication of the incubator story with the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. We see the weapons of mass destruction that devastated Iraq. We see the rape in Benghazi, etc., etc. You know, women's rights in Afghanistan, everything. But let's look at, you know, how women's rights have fared in Afghanistan. Let's look at how Libya has fared since US intervention. Iraq is a devastated, sick country. I mean, sick, literally physically sick country. It's suffering the fallout of the use of depleted uranium in the American campaign waged against Iraq on the basis of the dodgy dossier, which was then weapons of mass destruction. And Syria is no different. The dodgy dossier in Syria is the chemical weapon dossier. And you mentioned in the beginning, you know, sniffing out. And this kind of made me laugh because if you remember Arwa Damon from CNN after the alleged Douma chemical attack, sniffing backpacks in Idlib and claiming that, yeah, for sure, you know, there was a chemical attack in Douma because she can smell it on the backpacks. I mean, this is the level of fabrication, right, that we're seeing. And Arwa Damon, let's take her as an example. I've actually made a documentary called The Veto, which archives all of the early fabrications leading up to 2013 when the chemical attack, weapon attacks started as a narrative. But prior to 2013, what The Veto does is actually expose the massive fabrications that were going on directly by the media. From 2013 onwards, what happened was they realized that their entire propaganda narrative was failing and it was starting to be exposed. So then they brought in what were effectively outreach agents to give them plausible deniability and to give them organizations on the ground like the White Helmets, like a number of other so-called NGOs and citizen journalist groups and activists and so on, all trained by British Foreign Office outreach agents, established on the ground in Syria to start manufacturing the narratives that would criminalize the Syrian government and its allies. And of course, that gave us, in 2013 in August, the first chemical attack that has been largely discredited, as all of them have been. But coming forward to Douma, April 2018. Now, I was in Damascus when this alleged attack happened, as was Robert Fisk, who unfortunately passed away, of course, journalist for the Independent newspaper in the UK. And just prior to this attack, an important bit of information was that I went with a number of journalists, which included CNN's Frederick Pleitgen. And we went to some of the recently liberated areas of eastern Damascus, liberated from armed groups that were dominated by Al-Qaeda, even if they were not Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda or any of the rebrands that were given to this particular group. The splinter groups themselves were both controlled by Al-Qaeda and through their ideology were affiliated to Al-Qaeda. I tend to see the armed groups as mafia. Basically, they have an overarching ideology which is the same. They will fight over territory, they will fight over money, they will fight over drugs, they will fight over exactly as any mafia complex will do, right? And so the day before the Douma chemical attack, we entered liberated areas of eastern Damascus. And as I said, I was with CNN's Frederick Pleitgen during, and again, this is something which is always used to smear us by the likes of the BBC. Yes, we went on a government tour, but the reason we go on a government tour is for our protection. We were actually turned back from one area because fighting was still continuing. So for me, and I think for people like Channel 4 and the BBC and The Guardian, actually they're very appreciative of the government protection when they're actually in these fairly high-risk situations. But when they come back home, of course, what they do then is start saying, yeah, but you went on these government tours, you were given protection by the Syrian army, etc. So just to give people an understanding of what happens in these situations. So accompanied by Frederick Pleitgen, we visited munitions factories belonging to the armed groups. We visited chemical weapon labs, or what looked very much like chemical weapon manufacturing sites where they had manuals on how to make grenades filled with chlorine, etc. Right? Now, when Pleitgen put out his report on the alleged Douma chemical attack the day after, he completely omitted this information. Right? So this is an example of lying by omission. Right. Because instead of contextualizing the story, he simply put the story out as, well, it looks like the Syrian government has carried out another chemical attack, blah, 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 just as they are liberating Douma. So that was my first inkling that, hold on, you know, this is just another in a long line.
So I saw some of your tweets, and I'm going to discuss some of them because they're very informative threads. In 2019, you wrote this article for RT that the BBC depicted as staged hospital scenes as proof of Douma's chemical attacks. Can you expand on this and the interaction of journalists coming out later and admitting the attacks were fake when new information was coming in?
Yeah, I mean, basically, as I said, I was in Damascus when these attacks happened, and then I visited Douma shortly after the attack. Now, the first thing I noticed was that civilians were out in the streets. So had this been a sarin attack, of course, that would have been entirely impossible. Because the sarin residue would still, as far as I understand, I'm not a chemist, would still affect them. I spoke to medical staff who told me that there was no chemical attack, that people were coming in suffering from standard smoke inhalation from the battles that were ongoing to liberate Douma. So shelling, mortar fire, etc. And so it was smoke inhalation. I was told that at some point the white helmets rushed in and started screaming chemical attack and basically hosing people down and filming them. Right. And this story, I mean, this story, you know, was recounted by Robert Fisk. It was the Russians took witnesses to this, including the boy that was in the original movie made by the armed groups and the White Helmets. They took the boy to The Hague to give evidence that he wasn't suffering from a chemical attack. But none of this, of course, was accepted by the mainstream media. Now, what we do have to remember is that this dodgy dossier, this chemical weapon attack, led to the unlawful aggression of the UK, the US, and France against Syria, and the bombing of Damascus, the destroying of a cancer research laboratory on the basis that it was a chemical weapon factory. Right. Erroneously, the OPCW confirmed it was not. Now, a bit later, I think it was last year, Riyam Dalati, who's a BBC producer, put out a tweet. He'd already put out a tweet complaining about the rearrangement of bodies by the armed groups in order to create a sort of suitably sympathy eliciting photograph for the Western public. He'd already complained about that. That tweet had been deleted, presumably on the instructions of the BBC. He then put out a tweet saying that after 6 months of investigation, he was convinced that the hospital scenes were staged. So, I mean, this was an extraordinary admission by a BBC producer.
Yeah.
My point is in my thread that coming forward to the OPCW scandal that has broken, and obviously we'll go into more depth on that, that this information has for some reason not been submitted to the OPCW investigation team by the BBC. Now, this is a dereliction of journalistic duty, but it's also dereliction of duty in the sense that, you know, this is a global incident that we're talking about here, and the BBC has a responsibility, if it has evidence of staging of an event or one part of an event, that it should make that information public and supply that information to the investigative body that is looking at these attacks now and in the future.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, which they're not doing. So that just tells you where their interests are. So you recently also highlighted this thread that the BBC actually removed a video report because it featured Noor al-Din Zinki, who was a torture and beheaders of child victims. This group, Abdullah Isa, in 2016 was murdered by this group. Now, you talk about Habak, who was seen filming next to one of the beheaders in the video. So Channel 4, then we saw that they distanced themselves from this when it was condemned. So are you saying that the BBC and co propped up a terrorist group to push their narrative?
Absolutely. And I would say that that has been done throughout this war against Syria. Just very quickly on that instance, what actually happened was that Chloe Hadjimatthew, for the May Day series, which is effectively an attempt to whitewash the white helmets and to discredit anyone that is exposing their war crimes in Syria. Now, those war crimes are being described to us by Syrian civilians. So in other words, I'm not the person that's making these accusations against the white helmets. I'm simply investigating what I'm being told on the ground in Syria by Syrian civilians. And in my opinion, this evidence is being completely ignored. These Syrian civilians are being completely marginalized and disappeared, as they have been throughout this 10-year war. Their voices are being smothered by these media agencies for power. And these accusations of organ trafficking, organ trade, child abduction, child trafficking are coming from Syrian civilians against the white helmets. Now, what Chloe did was to bring in Abd al-Qadir Habak, as you say, to provide a kind of theory that dismisses the idea of the white helmets being involved in organ trafficking. And what he basically does is he says, yeah, well, you know, sometimes when people were getting injured, we were taking them to Turkey. Why they were taking them to Turkey when they have hospitals very close by in Syria, I have no idea. The bodies were taken, or the still alive people were taken to Turkey. My side of the story, or the Syrian civilian side of the story, is the bodies were returned with the familiar stitching right the way down the sternum and a number of kilos lighter. In other words, the organs had been taken out. His excuse for this was they were taken for autopsies, even though they were still alive at this point, and many of them were lightly injured, and then they were brought back. Now, I mean, I'm not going to go into the whole intricacies of why this whole theory is a conspiracy theory by the BBC. But the interesting thing is they used Habak as a researcher for this program. They used Habak to provide testimony to cover up for the white helmets. Number one, Habak was trained by a British intelligence outreach agent, Basma Syria and ARC. Analysis, research, and knowledge. And ARC was responsible for the creation through James Lemasurier of the white helmet. So here we immediately have a conflict of interest, right? One.
Right.
But two, not only was Habak trained by the British Foreign Office, as you rightly say in the Channel 4 documentary, Up Close with the Rebels in Aleppo, he effectively provided the footage that Channel 4 used for their report. But unfortunately for Channel 4, Habak was filming with Nur al-Din Zinki, a group that was formerly sponsored by the United States and who was filmed beheading a 12-year-old child in July 2016. Now, again, very important. The square where they beheaded the child was 200 meters from the White Helmet Center, the main White Helmet Center in Al Ansari in East Aleppo. The White Helmets did nothing to prevent this execution, and I was told later by witnesses that they came to mop up after the execution, to just remove the body and to clear away the evidence, which was their standard modus operandi when working with the armed groups. Now, Chloe Hadjimathieu, when I challenged her on the use of Habak as a researcher and a witness, she, basically flew at me on email and said, everything I said was inaccurate. Everything I said was wrong. Habak never worked with the armed groups. And yet here we have him in shot, filming next door to the guy that actually tortured and beheaded the 12-year-old child. Now, Channel 4, after a number of members of the public condemned this video, actually took it down. Of course, all of us had already downloaded it. At the beginning, in the Kathy Newman introduction, she makes it very clear that here the so-called rebel fighters, the so-called moderate extremists, are fighting with Al-Qaeda. So again, we have proof that Habak was working with groups that were affiliated and working under the control of Al-Qaeda. He was working with a group that had beheaded a 12-year-old child publicly and tortured him before that, taken him out of hospital and tortured him. He actually begged them to shoot him and to stop inflicting the pain on him. So these are the people that the BBC now are using to shore up their narratives. I mean, this is just extraordinary.
It's disgusting, frankly. And, America, as you know, has been complicit in a lot of this because they've been so busy cheering for their team blue or team red. Right now, a lot of people are happy because of Donald Trump's departure, ignoring obvious election tampering and welcoming censorship. I mean, we are being censored left and right here, and it seems like it's going to get worse with the Biden administration. But from the perspective of a person outside of this country, outside of the West, living with a population who's experienced such endless attacks from the West, with sanctions, drone strikes, attempted coups, etc. What, if anything, will change under a Biden administration?
I think it's about to get a whole lot worse. And this has been my complaint against the so-called left that has been cheering on the departure of Trump. They've become positively they were never this vociferous over the war against Syria, I have to say. But, the kind of injunctions taken out politically and media-wise against Trump have just been unbelievable. And the left has been, the most vehement in that, okay, anything is better than Trump.
Right.
But, my argument has been, but you're bringing in someone that is going to reset us. Talking about the Great Reset, we're basically resetting back to the Clinton-Obama era. You have Michelle Flournoy now as defense minister. Well, she was in charge, or one of the people in charge of Obama's drone warfare program, right?
Yeah.
You have Antony Blinken. You can't get someone that is more embedded in neocon supremacy than Blinken. A staunch anti-Iran, absolutely for intervention, military intervention in Syria. You have an array in the administration, and let's not talk about the COVID-19 task force.
Oh,
But
we'll get there.
you know,
We'll get there.
Biden is just, it's terrifying, actually. And we're talking about a dark winter. We're talking about where we're coming, and of course, next year we can't forget the correlation of Biden's inauguration. If, of course, this whole thing of Trump contesting it and so on, in my opinion, is just part of the theater, right? Designed to manufacture civil war and unrest inside America itself. But in my view, Trump will move out of the way in the end. Biden will come in. And at that point, of course, next year we have elections here in Syria. So the correlation here, and I think it was Scott Ritter that wrote about the fact that the last time we saw this kind of charade was in 2000, just before George W. Bush came in. And of course, he brought in Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld, Cheney, Condoleezza Rice. And immediately after that, we had, guess what, 9/11 and the war on terror. Now we have Biden coming in with a kind of default position administration back to the Clinton-Obama era. We've even got Kerry in there. We've got Clinton probably in there as ambassador to somewhere, Obama. The whole lot of them are coming back into this. It's terrifying. And we're having, Whitney Webb has been highlighting the fact that the Department for Homeland Security has been predicting a new 9/11. Well, hi guys, let's look at the correlation here. Let's look at the parallels, right, between 2000 and now. Scott Ritter is absolutely right in highlighting this. It's kind of frightening, not only for America, but more for the rest of the world. And of course, we've seen the recent assassination of one of the top nuclear scientists on the streets of Tehran. Previously we had Trump killing Soleimani and Mohandes, the leader of the PMU in Iraq. But now we're seeing, an intensification of this anti-Iran narrative. We've actually moved away from the Cold War narratives to some degree to the anti-Iran narratives.
So you're telling me that the bombs and the sanctions won't feel better with a Democrat or a woman at the helm pushing them? Is that what you're saying?
No. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make any difference. As I said before, Democrat, Republican. Look at. Biden actually represents a kind of bipartisan war party, right?
So we were talking about the Biden administration and how it's really, the sanctions, the bombs, the drone strikes aren't really going to feel that different, whether it's a Democrat or Republican or a woman. Mainly because we were seeing a lot of the left, as you mentioned before, cheer for censorship, cheer that Trump's out, but simultaneously cheer for the reset back into the Obama Clinton era. So you were saying it's not going to be any different in Syria. Is there an argument that a Trump presidency would have been better for Syria, or is it really just it's the military industrial complex is always in charge, the Pentagon, etc.?
Look, Trump is kind of a disaster. Also, he has ensured the savagery of sanctions here increased by the Caesar law, of course, under his administration. And the Caesar law based again on a fake report commissioned by Qatar. Qatar is one of the main founders of the terrorist groups, sponsors of the terrorist groups inside Syria, including Al-Qaeda. Rick Sterling has done a comprehensive takedown of the Caesar report, which I recommend everyone to read. So Trump has certainly not been good for Syria or for the region. But to some degree, Trump has been a lot more transparent than previous presidents. He's come out quite clearly saying that we're only there to take the oil, the oil pays for the wars, etc. But to be fair to Trump, he has always had a policy of drawdown of troops. And in Syria, of course, it's become apparent recently that he was lied to about the number of troops actually inside Syria. But having said that, under the cover of COVID-19, of course, America started to build up again their troop presence, their military footprint inside Syria. I think the thing is with Trump, he's kind of difficult to call. He's relatively maverick. He will flip his policy depending on pretty much his mood one week or the other.
Right.
He's done some things that give an indication that he's looking at pulling America out of its occupation of the sovereign territory of other countries. With Biden, I think we're back to, as we've said, the very clear interventionist, global supremacy, US military, PR, the strengthening of NATO. We're very much back to this war hawkery, that to some degree had been dampened under Trump, who was much more economically focused, let's say.
I mean, yeah. I mean, with Joe Biden presidency, you're going to get a more crypto type of imperialism. That is just, it's harder for people to fight against because Biden is not the flamboyant out there character that Trump is. And I think that's why a lot of Americans hate Donald Trump too, because he represents he shows the ugliness in America. He tells you, like, we're going to go get their oil.
Sure, yeah.
Like that doesn't happen.
And also, yeah, if you look at Biden's administration again, I mean, you've got huge numbers of, I was going to say MI6. I mean, they are pretty much one and the same, but CIA intelligence operatives, revolving door Congress people that have always been involved in pharma, in big pharma, in the military-industrial complex, and in the whole philanthro-capitalist complex. So yeah, you've got people that are going to be a lot more underhand about it, that are going to fabricate the narratives. And a lot of people have pointed out to me that that's maybe why right now the BBC and all of these media outlets are focused on destroying the destroyers of narratives. In other words, they're out there to try and completely draw a line under these annoying academics and researchers and journalists that have exposed their hybrid war strategy in Syria in order to kind of clear the board for Biden coming in, and potentially some kind of, not necessarily high intensity war against Iran, but definitely some kind of hybrid war. I think we're going to see a lot more of this whole hybrid war strategy, whether it's bioterror attacks, whether it's economic pressure being brought to bear on kind of nations that are considered to be enemies of the let's say the US state, but of course that also means the Zionist state, right? We can't divide these two, particularly in this region. Anyone who is perceived to be a threat to Israeli security, and we have to remember that Kamala Harris is pledging, what is it, 38 billion over the next 10 years, 10.4 million per day to the Zionist entity. So, this is an indication of where Biden's sympathies lie, and his administration is simply reinforcing that impression. So I think next year, 2021, everyone here certainly is bracing themselves.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you mentioned the elections. Now, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that, because in America, we think every country needs our help in having fair and democratic elections. But it doesn't seem like we can manage that in our own system. We can't manage to have elections that are fair and transparent. I am an election integrity activist as well. I do a lot of work on that end. While I do not like Donald Trump in the slightest, I do feel like there were manipulations here in this election, 100%, just like they were for Sanders when he was running against both Clinton and then Biden. And they used COVID as well with these mail-in ballots, etc. Through the investigations we've done here, we've found so much lack of transparency. And, Whitney Webb talked about the machines and who owns these machines and where the connections are with these machines, etc. So do you believe that America in general has fair and free elections at all?
No. But, I think this whole thing of conquering a country, bombing a country to bring democracy is just, it's just global insanity. You can't compare culture in the Middle East to culture in America, number one, right? I've said this before, but if you look at Middle Eastern culture, and if we look at Syrian culture, if we go back to 2012, Jonathan Steele for The Guardian wrote very eloquently about the fact that even though, allegedly there were all these uprisings, many of them were a lot smaller than they were being described in the West, and that actually the majority of the Syrian people, even opposition members, were supporting President Assad. And this has been the truth throughout this war. If you come to Syria, 85% of Syria that is now back under the protection of the government, people support President Assad. They may not support things that the government is doing. They may not support the Minister of Electricity, etc., but they support their president because the president has given them stability throughout this 10 years. He's provided food, he's provided wages, he's provided subsidized food and fuel and so on for his people. He's maintained a stability that no other leader really has achieved in the Middle East when under attack, but by unbelievably disproportionate power of the US coalition. And so I think it's just insane for either the UK or the US to project any kind of sort of perceived superiority or exceptionalism in the case of the US onto nations that have completely different history, culture, heritage, and an understanding of their political processes, right? We don't have any right, I'm speaking as a British person now, we don't have the right to do this. We don't have the right to come into countries as the British have done and to carve them up into partitioned sectarian statelets that serve our purpose. We don't have the right to do this. Imagine if this was being done to us.
Yeah.
We'd be up in arms about it. So, hey, why are people surprised that Syria is defending itself?
Yeah, that's the thing. Syria is defending itself, just like every other great nation that doesn't want to be underneath our imperialist boot. Along those lines, though, you've talked about a little bit about the left and these progressives. Now, I am somebody that thinks, especially with the censorship and the need for independent journalism, that we need to look at a post-partisan future when it comes to certain things. However, I consider myself on the left, and I just feel very alone because I feel like a lot of the people, like the Squad and AOC, are pretty much pushing people back into the Democratic Party. From your outsider perspective, what is your opinion on these progressive Democrats in Congress?
I think you hit it on the head when you said we need to get away from these partisan ideas. We need to get away from this whole kind of left-right paradigm. What we're facing now is a war against humanity, and I can't put it any more clearly than that. All right. Exactly as you are, I would probably align myself more with the left. But at the same time, those that have been more open to discourse are the right. Right. Yeah. So, the censorship, the new fascism is actually coming from the left, particularly over COVID-19. The shutdown has come from the left. The censorship has come from the left. The fascism has come from the left. Right. You're not allowed to speak. They're supporting the censorship of people that are worried about a vaccine that has been developed in warp speed time, right? I mean, not even talking about all the other components of the vaccine.
Not only that, it's Pfizer and AstraZeneca and all these big pharma.
Exactly. People forget the history of the pandemic, vaccine, and the brain damage, the transverse myelitis, the autism connections. When you start to look at it, people have a right to be concerned, but the left doesn't think so. The left thinks you should all shut up and just wear your mask and, be good sheep and don't question anything. The right is open to discourse. The people we have questioning the COVID-19 narrative in the UK, people like Peter Hitchens, who's, a totally self-proclaimed conservative, right? It's conservative MPs that are standing up and speaking out against the COVID-19 measures in the UK.
Interesting.
So I think right now, for me, I'm trying to get out of this left-right paradigm. I'm trying to say, guys, we need to unite against a much bigger threat than the Republicans or the Democrats or the Labor or the Conservative, which are basically the lines between the two are so blurred now anyway. Sure, there are progressives, but let's not kind of divide our resistance down into smaller and smaller groups.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. We need to be united against really what is a threat against our entire culture, heritage. I mean, our social interaction. We're going to be isolated. We are being isolated. We're being divided. We're being manipulated. We are being divided into left and right. We're being divided into race wars. We're being divided into class wars, and effectively, it is a major. It's a major class war that is going on.
Yeah.
So, you know, I just think let's not allow ourselves to be divided and recompartmentalized again and again, and kind of watered down into smaller and smaller factions that are more isolated and less able to actually push back. That's my view on it.
Well, you know, I tend to agree with you because it's funny you mentioned that about the British PMs, because here the people questioning the censorship, if it's, you know, if it's not like some outliers like myself and a few others here, it's literally everybody on the left is falling in line. It's coming from the Republicans. It's coming from the conservatives. And I'm not trying to necessarily say I agree with their ideology, because I don't. But I am saying one should have, at the very least, the ability to question something. When did we make it like a bad thing to question a narrative, especially when we've been lied to time and time again, especially as Americans? We have been lied to continuously. America's is experiencing right now, what they're experiencing is cognitive dissonance, because a lot of the things they were told were completely fabricated, and so they're having a really hard time grappling with what's the reality. And it's much safer to stay in your, you know, on your corner. And it's like American football, you know, you pick your team and you're cheering. It is the give them bread and circus, you know, aspect of it that's happening with us.
I think also it's a protracted gaslighting campaign by successive governments, not Democrat, Republican, but as you said before, by you know the entities behind the government. It's a gaslighting campaign. It's the erosion of people's ability to judge a situation for themselves. They're literally waiting to be fed what's going on, right? They've lost their ability to form their own rationale. Not all. Okay, there are, thank God, some exceptions to the exceptionalism. But, you know, if you go back to the Obama era and how he imprinted on Americans that you are exceptional, you know, this is the exceptional nation. And so therefore, you know, Americans for a long time have been, not only Americans, but I think because America is a much younger culture, it's much more susceptible to the kind of gaslighting programs that have been introduced to basically bring them into line and to give them this impression that, yeah, you know, we are the kind of benevolent force in the world. We can put the world right. We can, you know, get rid of this tyrant and get rid of this tyrant, and people will live happily ever after. Literally, people believe in this myth. You know, they believe in the myth of their military being, as Sean Penn recently said, the greatest power for humanitarian progress. I mean, I'm not quoting him exactly, but that's pretty much what he said. You know, the greatest humanitarian force on this planet. Well, I can name you 10 countries off the top of my head that would disagree, right? Iraq being number one there.
Yeah, at least. So you pinned this tweet regarding COVID, and I wanted to discuss it because you said Americans have gotten wait, actually, let me pull it up. That's not the right one. Like, you did not say that. Okay. You said the virus is not causing economic collapse, child abuse, drug addiction, domestic violence, unemployment, suicide, depression, rising unrest, totalitarian governance, serfdom, neo-feudalism, austerity, dehumanization of the human race. The global ruling elite are. And I 100% agree with you. While I'm not, look, and we can talk about COVID now because you've been questioning this narrative, right? I'm not saying that COVID isn't a virus. What I am saying is it's being used and manipulated to get a certain narrative and get people to do something. So is COVID in itself itself being used by the global elite to to test certain behaviors out on people?
Oof, that's a big subject.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think we have to look at COVID-19, whatever it is being weaponized by the 0.001% of society, which
Right.
is the global, as I keep calling it, predator class, because people need to understand that, again, this is not a benevolent force. This is a force that can massacre people in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and Libya with absolutely no conscience, right?
Right.
It doesn't care the number of kids that are massacred in its bombing raids in all these countries, whether by proxy or directly. And they're weaponizing a virus that has killed less than 0.06 or 0.6 over population, global population, right? The facts and figures are there. And that is actually, it's less effective than the flu, than the seasonal flu. Now, in the UK, the flu figures have disappeared. They've been actually usurped by the COVID-19 figures. So we don't see flu figures anymore. We only see COVID-19. And of course, you know, there is the whole history, and it's proven, of falsification of numbers, the use of a test which gives false positives. The numbers have been manipulated, basically. This entire virus situation has been manipulated beyond belief to bring in measures which effectively have suppressed society. As I said, we're coming back to the division. They've divided society, you know, masks versus people who don't want to wear masks, people who want to take the vaccination versus people that don't want to take the vaccination.
Right.
But if we look at where the state is placed, right? And again, I'm not talking Democrat, I'm not talking Republican, although the Republicans have actually pushed back a little bit against the narrative compared to the left. We're back to that kind of weird paradigm, right?
Yeah.
So what we're seeing, of course, and this isn't some wild conspiracy theory. I mean, the World Economic Forum has stated quite clearly that we're heading for the Great Reset. You know, a recent speaker at Davos, I need to check his name, Yuval Harari, an Israeli AI techno-fascist guy, as far as I'm concerned, talked about the fact that once all this AI technology is introduced, he actually said in his speech at Davos earlier this year, that at that point, of course, he's trying to project this onto dictators somewhere else, right? But we're living effectively under a totalitarian state brought in by COVID-19, not only in America, but across Europe, in the UK, etc. And what he talked about was the fact that basically then what this will do is to turn countries into data colonies. I mean, this is terrifying language, right? And at this point, he actually said, we don't need soldiers to go in if we want to basically attack those colonies, those data colonies, because we can use the data. We can manipulate people through the data. This is the future that the World Economic Forum is envisaging for the world. And of course, what I'm talking about now is, which are the transnational global elite behind the government. So the government's actually now, we're seeing, I mean, the kind of confusion in the governments themselves as to the measures that are being introduced is an indication to me that they're not in control of this great reset gateway, which is COVID-19. That's what I see COVID-19 as. It's a portal to the great reset, right? It's the first step in the great reset.
And it's interesting. I mean, you know, you're right. And the thing is, when you question this, especially here, I don't know, when you question anything regarding COVID, I mean, they will take your stuff down, like on YouTube, on Twitter,
Yeah,
on
exactly.
Facebook. It's like, so it's like if they had nothing, if it was true, if everything they are saying is entirely true, which is hard for people to figure out, because you have, you know, yes, I believe in science, I believe in doctors, but I also know that even those people are now completely polarized depending on which party they're working for, right? So it's like, it's hard to discern anything. But if they had nothing to hide, why would they be censoring all these videos and all these people bringing up normal questions like, wait a minute, why is all this happening when the numbers are not as great as they initially said? And what the bigger point for me is, why aren't Americans being given anything more than a $1,200 check, one-time check? I mean, that's it. And then a little bit of hundreds of dollars of unemployment, which is it's absolutely nothing. I mean, it's like $200 some people are getting every 2 weeks. And most of that has ended. So if they wanted to actually help people, wouldn't they be more transparent about everything?
Absolutely. And wouldn't they be happier that some scientists, or actually a growing number of scientists and doctors, because you're talking about the YouTube censorship, but it's not against people like you or me, although it is, it's against effectively who we are platforming. So, but the people we're platforming are esteemed scientists, epidemiologists, doctors, nurses. They're people in the profession that should be listened to, right? You know, the nurses that are saying there's no COVID patients in the hospitals in the UK, for example, are being censored or sacked or intimidated. The doctors that are saying, you know, this virus is a non-virus, it's just nothing more than the seasonal flu, they're being censored. So why is the state not wanting to listen to a more optimistic view, right? This is my point. Shouldn't they be happy that, oh, well, great, you know, maybe this isn't as bad as we thought it was. This is fantastic. But no, they're doubling down on the narrative that it's the most dangerous thing in the whole of mankind. The guy they used in the UK, Professor Neil Ferguson, to model the response to COVID-19, he has a 100% failure record on every single so-called epidemic that he's forecast. He's got it absolutely 100% wrong, right? From swine flu, from foot and mouth in 2001, 12 million farm animals were slaughtered in the UK based on his projections, which were described as a complete disaster by his peers at the time. Right, so this is the guy the UK is basing their lockdown measures on. This is the guy, 100% failure record, right? And the US is basically following suit. The EU is following suit. And so my argument is what's happening is it is a class war. It's a war against the workers, because they are the ones that are now being reduced to entire dependency upon the state. I can't even remember, in the early stages of the so-called pandemic, I think in the UK there were something like 1.4 million claims for benefits, right? And that was early on, that was in March, April. So it's a reduction of the working class to complete dependency on the state. Right, and this is, I mean, the economic collapse that is going to come out of this is absolutely terrifying. Probably 60% of the population. France has been protesting these incoming austerity measures for 2 years, completely ignored in Western media, even before COVID-19. I was in France at this time attending the protests and seeing firsthand the state-sanctioned brutality, the shooting of people in the eye with the LBD rubber bullet, the wounding of people with sound grenades, but that contain rubber pellets that can enter flesh if they're thrown into tightly packed crowds. These were all being used. Tear gas, high toxicity tear gas being used against their own people. This was before COVID-19. Right, when France was protesting these austerity measures. And COVID-19 has simply, again, on many levels, increased that pressure both on target nations like Syria, right? It shut down the borders here. It increased the economic pressure here. It increased the feeling of pressure, of health issues. It highlighted the fact that, of course, economic sanctions have decimated the health sector here in Syria, not to mention the attacks from the terrorist groups on the hospitals, etc. So across the board, as I've said, this is a hybrid war strategy. It's a portal to the Great Reset. It's a dumbing down of everyone. It's a devastation of the economic independence of a huge percentage of the population. Child poverty, child abuse is rising under lockdown, depression, suicides. As I said, none of this is down to COVID-19. It's down to the weaponization of COVID-19.
Exactly, 100%. And with everything we've discussed today, it's so important to note how important journalism is and how important independent media is. And Julian Assange right now, of course, is still being held in Belmarsh prison. Americans have pretty much ignored the case. I mean, we have a few activists here, like Steve and in Action for Assange, but the vast majority of journalists did not cover it. And I mean, even if they do, it's because they're like harped and like like people come after them. Like, why aren't you covering Assange? Even in independent media, very few people have been covering Julian Assange. Why is right now more than ever so important to support Julian Assange? And also, what can we do as independent media to wake people up from them not seeing that there's a form of crypto fascism that is extremely dangerous right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I'll have to refer to the UK, but, we have now the government forming, I mean, we have military brigades basically working on shutting down discourse about COVID-19, the 77th Brigade, which is, a military faction being used on social media to censor, to attack anyone that is questioning the COVID-19 narrative. We now have a similar situation where actually, in my view, anyone questioning the vaccinations is ultimately going to be called a terrorist. They're going to be called a danger to national security, and they're going to be treated as such. That's coming. I really believe that is coming. Particularly in the UK, we're seeing the establishment of behind-the-scenes organizations determined. The UN is putting out information portals. I think one is called Verified, to attack back against people questioning the use of vaccination. So, we know that this is happening. We know from the BBC communications with myself, where they're talking about taking possible legal action for myself being involved in war crimes because of my reporting from inside Syria, right? So the Julian Assange case has set a precedent for all dissenting journalists, activists, researchers, academics, basically, in the sense that if you have an influence, if you become too powerful, if you become too strident, if you have too much of a following, you will be shut down. And if necessary, of course, they will use everything in their power against you, as they have done with Assange, which is effectively illegal incarceration, torture, imprisonment, absolute, sting operations against him. So I think, why every single journalist should be up in arms about this is because today it's Assange, tomorrow it can be you, it can be me, it can be any one of us. And it can be any one of the corporate journalists that decides in their own conscience that they can't that they can't shut up about something they've seen, that they don't agree with. Look at the OPCW inspectors who've spoken out against the suppression of their evidence in the final report from the OPCW. They are being demonized, criminalized, the whole process again.
Yeah.
And the problem is that while we allow the Assange torture and incarceration to continue, we open the door to it happening to ourselves. And I think that's what every single one of us, that at some point in our career or our life, want to speak up about some injustice. We should be thinking about the greatest injustice that's happening right now, which is against Julian Assange.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end it, Vanessa. Thank you so much. What's the latest thing you've written, and where can people find your work?
I just wrote something which for Americans will resonate, I think, about Sean Penn and the COVID-19 complex, the COVID-19 propaganda complex. And that was for Whitney at Unlimited Hangout. Most of my stuff, either I usually republish it at my Patreon site, and if anyone wants to help me out and donate, even $1 a month is a help. We're all independent. We don't have the corporate backing of the BBC and the Guardian, but we're having an effect. And the thing is, without not myself, but all of it, this world would become very monochrome, very dangerous, actually. Very, very dangerous, because without this information, whatever you think of us, if you think we're conspiracy theorists, whatever, but at least you have a balance. At least you have somewhere you can go to find alternative information, alternative views, diverging views. And without that, our world is really dangerous.
With that.
Yeah, doomed.
You got to fight for something. So thank you very much for being on the right side of justice, for speaking out. I know it's tough with all the the backlash you get. I know what that's like. I know what it's like being called a right winger, a Trumper, an Assadist, a Russian asset. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your bravery. And and it's funny, the Russians went away for this election too. Americans just didn't mention them this election.
Oh,
So
I know. It's amazing how these narratives disappear. Like, remember Floyd? Suddenly the Floyd narrative took over, and everyone that was previously sheltering down from COVID was out on the streets. So, just remember, we're being manipulated every minute of every day.
100%.
And be aware of it.
Exactly. If we're fighting each other, we can't fight them at the top. That's the whole thing we have to remember.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I appreciate
you.
it, and we'll have you back on sometime live.
Thanks. All right. Thank you so much, Fiorella, and thanks for everything you do.
Thank you as well. Have a great rest of your day.